Chapter 1. The heat was oppressive, 114 degrees in the shade, but finding shade was the problem. It was mid-afternoon. At least it felt that way. It always felt that way. The huge reddish orb that passed for a sun hung high in the western sky. It might just as well have been nailed to the dusty amber firmament. And except for those times when dust storms obscured it from view, it was just another eternal fixture of this grim, arid landscape. It was an unforgiving land. Never as much as a drop of rain fell upon these forsaken plains, nor did a single lichen cling to the rocks. It was the template of utter desolation. Yet this was not a place whose silence was broken only by the occasional howling winds of a fierce dust storm. No, there was no peace to be found here. The air was full of sounds, weeping, shrieks of pain, screeching birds, and clanking chains. These sounds were a natural part of this place, as natural as the blazing sun or blowing sands. Across the plains, a myriad of altars, composed of polished black marble, were laid out in orderly rows as far as the eye could see. It was reminiscent of a great city, its streets and avenues laid out in perfect geometric precision. Draped over most of these altars were rag-clad humans, their wrists, ankles, and necks securely restrained by chains and manacles. So short were these black monoliths that their occupants' heads and their legs from the ankles down dangled over the ends. Here, shackled and scantily clad, they were exposed to the harsh elements. Yet the harshness of those elements went beyond oppressive heat and the discomfort of tight, barbed restraints. For above this field of agony, large birds, scavengers, glided and pirouetted on the thermals. They were a savage and aggressive lot, with a 3-foot wingspan, oversized heads, and large beaks with jaws as powerful as steel traps. They were the result of evolution gone horribly wrong. Scavengers with an instinct and physiology adapted specifically for preying upon a single species, humans. Indeed, the flesh of these helpless humans was the birds' sole source of nourishment, and the human blood their only source of moisture. Occasionally, the birds would swoop down to claim a piece of the living flesh offered to them upon the altars. They would land upon their prone human prey, digging into soft flesh with their razor-like talons, pecking into it with their sharp beaks, and eventually coming up with slices of stringy meat that they swiftly and greedily gulped down. So numerous were these scavengers that 2 or 3 of them might gather to feed upon one human at any given time, a gruesome feeding frenzy. Through it all, the prey would squirm and curse, scream and cry, yet to no avail, for they were shackled too tightly to their altars to offer any meaningful resistance. It took several hours of continual feeding for the birds to reduce a human being to a mass of indigestible organs, bones, and sinew. Then they would fly off, seeking out heartier pickings elsewhere. Yet the story didn't end there. In the absence of the feasting birds, the bodies of the desecrated humans would undergo a swift yet grotesque process of regeneration, becoming whole again within the span of an hour. Then the cycle of feeding began anew. Here there was mortal pain and horror without the ultimate release mortality offered, for there was no death. All of these victims had already died once, and that experience of death would not be repeated. This was hell, and hell was forever. Raspith stood amidst the carnage like some vulgar stone gargoyle, gazing across the flat, barren plain. He looked across the myriad of altars toward a low range of mountains in the distance, mountains that seemed to undulate and ripple with the passing waves of heat. It had been a full hour since he had so much as moved a muscle. His bat-like wings were folded tightly together, arching a good 2 feet over his head and nearly touching the ground behind him. His wrinkled tan face exhibited a menacing scowl, yet his wide green eyes held a blank stare. He seemed totally unaffected by the goings-on around him. No, the cries of anguish from the altars were of little consequence to him. He had learned to tune them out long ago. If anything, he found some measure of comfort in their screams. After all, they were just humans, abominable creatures, made in the image of God, pale imitations of their Creator. They exhibited the physical perfection of their Creator, yet deep within they were creatures most foul, full of rage, hatred, envy, and avarice. No, this was the perfect place for them, a fitting destiny, an eternal supply of food for the scavengers of the air. Here, at least, they served some useful purpose. Raspith was the lone sentinel watching over 10,000 of these loathsome creatures, the guardian who would ensure that none would escape their eternal destiny. But what was the point of it? How would one of them escape? They were all securely shackled to their altars, dehydrated, weakened by the pain and the heat. They weren't going anywhere. No, this assignment was an act of personal retribution against him. It was the sort of assignment given to a minor demon of the 7th rank, not a lieutenant such as himself. A lieutenant? No, former lieutenant now. And these humans were to blame. Actually, it was just one human who bore the blame for his fall from grace, and ironically, he had never even met her. 6 years ago, that new female arrival had been sentenced by the Master himself to the most vile torment to be found in all of hell, the sea of fire, a flaming ocean of black oil that fully encompassed a third of Satan's realm. There, in the midst of a broiling, heaving nightmare, she would come to know another definition of pain, terror, and eventual madness. At least that was the intent. Yet after only 4 months into her eternal sentence, she had simply vanished. It seemed absolutely impossible. After all, no human had ever escaped from that turbulent, fiery realm. The shoreline around the sea were steep and rugged. The sea itself was turbulent and well patrolled, and the humans within too weak and crazy with pain to formulate an escape. But somehow she had. An exhaustive search for her had yielded nothing. Raspith had been assigned the task of recovering her. Indeed, his desire for power and accolades had compelled him to volunteer for the assignment. Yet things had gone horribly wrong. She had slipped through his grasp, and during the search, a demon of the 6th rank under his own command had vanished without a trace. Worse still, the human female had escaped hell altogether by means he didn't even pretend to understand. Now she was back on earth, proclaiming the message of salvation, stealing hell-bound souls from the Master, and the burden of the blame had been passed from minion to minion, inevitably falling squarely on his shoulders. Over the years, her name had been burned indelibly into his mind, Serena Farnsworth. The incident had enraged the Master, and led to Rathspith's demotion into the company of the lowest ranks of demons, relegating him to the dirtiest and most mundane tasks in the Dark Kingdom. Had it ended there, things would have been bad enough. But Serena Farnsworth was just the first of a series of missing humans. Some months later, another human disappeared without a trace. Additional months of searching had yielded not so much as a trace of her. She had vanished from hell. Then went another, and another. Satan was positively livid. The disappearances led to the implementation of more rigorous security measures, more monitoring of the humans. That edict had brought him here, and here he had remained. All of his appeals for a transfer had been declined by his superiors, so he was stuck. And that fate, the one so cruelly dealt him, ate at him as surely as the birds ate the nearly desiccated bodies of these miserable humans around him. He had gone over it again and again in his mind. It had become his personal tormentor during these past years. This time, amidst his simmering rage, he hadn't noticed the small gray cloud sweeping across the plains toward him. High above the dusty plains, a large buzzard began to descend toward a now fully restored victim who was struggling frantically upon her black altar near the edge of the field of agony. The buzzard circled the newly discovered prey, but then a small brown creature flew past him. He instinctively abandoned the descent toward the human and pursued it. Perhaps it would offer more moisture than the dried-up human. His sharp beak opened wide, even as the small, insect-like creature was overtaken and swept in. His huge beak snapped shut, yet he was unable to swallow his prey. It resisted, lodged itself firmly in his throat. The vulture gagged, swung his head from side to side, yet to no avail. Then came the burning stings, and a spreading of blood across the feathers of the vulture's neck. Seconds later, his neck exploded, body and head parted company, and the buzzard plummeted end over end toward the desert below. The small creature continued on its way. It was only when several other of the winged tormentors had met a similar fate that Rathspith's attention was drawn to the aerial carnage. He stood in wonder as the birds scattered in confusion, meeting their deaths as a result of a common mistake. A moment later, Rathspith noted one of the small creatures fly swiftly past, only a few feet to his right. Then one passed him to the left, then overhead. "By the lights of Sheol," he cursed, swinging about and drawing his sword. There were no insects in this region of hell. So what were these things? He had a bad feeling. These creatures, whatever they were, possessed a troubling aura. Then he felt the sharp pain in his back. It was like the sting of a scorpion, only worse. Then another and another. Rathspith screamed and swung wildly about, thrashing his shimmering sword in the air. But that was all it encountered. Air. These tiny beasts were too swift, too agile to kill with a sword. Within seconds, he was engulfed in a stinging, biting cloud of tiny creatures. As the battle raged, the creatures were causing buzzard feathers, body parts, and blood to rain down from the sky, even as Rathspith flapped his mighty wings, wildly generating powerful whirlwinds that he hoped would sweep his tormentors away. Yet this, too, was a futile effort, for now over 100 of them were gnawing ferociously at him. He raced forward, tumbling over an empty altar, and crashed to the ground, all the while flailing about frantically. He had to take to the air and get help, yet his leathery wings were already in tatters, and he was being weighed down by ever-increasing numbers of the six-legged creatures. For more than a minute he screamed in a shrill, unearthly voice before falling silent. Across the plains, other voices cried out as the creatures lit into victims upon the altars, yet their assaults were selective. Some of the victims were swarmed by hundreds of the creatures, while others were left in peace. Within minutes, Raspith had been reduced to little more than a collection of bones, shredded muscles, and indigestible organs. Yet, like the desecrated humans around him, he could not die. He gazed out at the creatures that had now ended their vicious assault and gathered in a circle around him, observing him intently. They were furry, tan to brown in color, with 6 legs and a long, sharp, scorpion-like stinger on their tails. Their wings, translucent as gossamer, vibrated in unison. Their heads were large, and their faces, they had an almost human quality. They had long, flowing hair on their heads, yet their mouths held a set of razor-sharp teeth. Never had Raspith seen such creatures in hell, or anywhere else. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. His vocal cords had been ripped from his throat. About a dozen feet away, a strange apparition appeared in midair. It was like a glistening field of stars, and at its very core, a growing glow. From its heart stepped 3 angels, clothed wholly in black. They had the faces of men and great black wings like those of a gigantic crow. They approached the demonic sentry. The dark angel in the center dropped to one knee before the prone minion of Satan. The small creatures moved out of the way to make room for him. "How far have you fallen, my dear Raspith?" he said, not a trace of emotion in his voice. He looked at his compatriot to the right. "Find him. I want us in and out of here as quickly as possible." "I shall," he confirmed, making his way among the city of black altars in the company of a second angel. Raspith was regenerating, like all beings of his kind, though it was a slow and excruciatingly painful process. For the first time in his existence, he was gaining an appreciation for the suffering of his human victims. "Who are you?" The dark angel looked into Raspith's one remaining eye. "Someone you'd probably wished you'd never met. I am the voice of change, of reason. This is all that you need to know." The dark angel gazed about at the myriad of tiny creatures that still surrounded Raspith. "I would not make any sudden moves if I were you. You wouldn't want to make my friends nervous." The dark angel turned away from his prone adversary, gazing at the sky. The vultures, what few were left, had scattered in all directions, and the skies overhead were, for the first time in centuries, free of their terrible presence. Then he looked across the fields of agony. Most of his legions of small creatures were on the ground, apparently resting. Only a few circled overhead. The dark angel seemed anxious, nervous, as he again scanned the skies. "We have found the one you sought," said one of the dark angels, returning from his brief quest. "He was exactly where you said he would be." "Then fortune is with us," said the first. "Take me to him." Dr. Tom Carson was still in a daze. He gazed at the blazing red sun behind him. The tight chain looped around his throat pulled his head back so he could do little else. The movement of his arms and legs were accompanied by a metallic dragging sound, followed by a sudden arrest of their motion. No, he was still here. Yet the cycle of regeneration and desecration of his body had somehow been broken. It now felt unnatural to be without pain. His body was whole once more, of that much he was certain. The terrible itching and random sharp pains associated with the rapid regeneration of his flesh had ended some time ago, yet the scavengers had not resumed their feast. These precious minutes without pain were a blessing. Even the screaming and wailing of those around him had nearly gone silent, reduced to a soft murmuring. In the absence of pain, he lingered in a state near sleep. Had the end of eternity finally arrived? That was when Satan had told him that his torments would end. His time on this terrible altar had seemed like it was dragging on into eternity. It had been many months, perhaps years, but not eternity, unless Satan's definition of the term was different from his, unless time here was somehow different from time on earth. Nevertheless, these past months had been nightmarish. This was the punishment for his greed, his lack of charity. At least that was what Satan had claimed. This precious moment gave him the time and clearness of mind to review his earthly existence. Yet he had been something less than generous when it came to his money. He openly admitted it. But more importantly, he had rejected the love of Christ and the salvation he had freely offered him. No, he hadn't lived a perfect life. But did these flaws in his character warrant such extreme measures as these? If only he had it all to do over again. If only he had known. "Jesus, help me," he whispered, realizing that prayers were probably pointless in hell. There was a sudden darkness. Dr. Carson sensed the presence of someone or something standing over him. "I am not Jesus, Dr. Carson, but perhaps I am in a position to help you." Carson opened his eyes to see 3 dark angels standing over him. "Who are you?" "Someone in need of your services," was the reply. "My services? You need my services?" His voice quivering, almost weeping. What could he do for someone? "That is correct," replied the dark angel, his voice deep and impassionate. "You are an expert in the field of particle and plasma physics. Is this not true?" Particle and plasma physics. That was an eternity ago. Right now, the principles of physics were the furthest thing from his mind. Were they even still there? Or had so much pain driven them out? This had to be a dream, a delusion. "Yes," was all that he could manage to say. He hoped that it was the right answer. He felt a gentle hand upon his bare shoulder. "I know that this is difficult for you," said the dark angel. "I don't expect you to be at your best right now. Not under these conditions. But answer me this. Would you be willing to serve me and provide me with the information I seek?" Carson did his best to sort out the words of the angel, to make sense of what he had just heard. He was certain that he discerned a trace of concern, perhaps even compassion, in this strange being's voice. "I'll serve you. I promise." "That is all I wanted to hear," said the dark angel. Carson felt pressure on his arms, like something was walking across them. He struggled to lift his head, pulling against the thick chain around his throat, to see about a dozen tiny brown creatures attacking the shackles around his wrists. He watched as they dug into the heavy metal with their powerful teeth, shearing off small shards with each bite. He could feel powerful vibrations being transmitted, even through the chain around his throat. In seconds, the tight chain slipped off, severed at its base. The shackles around his wrists and ankles grew uncomfortably hot, as sparks and metal fragments were scattering. His right wrist shackle was severed first. He withdrew his brutally desecrated wrist from its barbed interior with the assistance of one of the dark angels. His left wrist shackle was next, followed by his ankle shackles, as he was assisted to a sitting position upon the altar. He had never imagined rising from his slab of agony. For a moment, he looked down at one of the tiny creatures that had freed him and returned its gaze. "Thank you," said Carson. He was surprised when it smiled at him. Did this strange being actually comprehend his words? "We must move quickly," warned one of the dark angels, assisting Carson in swinging his legs over the side of the altar and bringing him to a standing position. The world around him grew dark. For a moment, Carson was certain that he would pass out, yet his senses quickly returned to him as he walked with assistance across the rough, rocky terrain. "Take him back to refuge," said the dark angelic leader. "See that he is made comfortable. He will no doubt need some rest." "Wait," said Carson. "Who are you? What's going on?" For the first time, the angelic leader smiled, though slightly. "I am your benefactor. My name is Abaddon. You shall assist me in bringing about a new order in this place, an order of justice. Welcome to the revolution." Carson nodded weakly as a sparkling sphere of stars and mist appeared before him. He was gently assisted by one of the dark angels into the mist. A fraction of a second later, they both dematerialized from the plains. Their mission completed, the tiny minions of Abaddon scattered, taking flight eastward. Only those few guarding the demon Raspith remained. Abaddon scanned the plains one more time. Other humans had taken note of what had transpired and now begged for mercy, begged to be released from their torments. Abaddon shook his head sadly, turning to his lieutenant. "Would that we could have taken more of them with us. I regret having to leave so many deserving of our aid behind." "We have not the time," warned his compatriot, looking nervously about. "Our risk increases even now. Surely we should tarry no longer." Abaddon hesitated. "Of this I am aware, Lennar. Nonetheless, we have one more task to accomplish before we depart. To me, it is a matter of some importance, a personal matter." Lennar looked at his leader incredulously, yet said nothing. Abaddon returned to deal with the last loose end in this whole operation, Raspith. By this time, Raspith had regenerated almost completely. Still, the process was apparently causing him much discomfort. Abaddon gazed at his nemesis with impassioned eyes. "My time is short, but I am obligated by conscience to deal with you as true justice would demand." "Justice," sneered Raspith. "What know thee of justice? Look about ye, dark angel. This is justice, the master's justice. They are all well deserving of the calamity which has befallen them. Not one of them is innocent." "Yes, I know," confirmed Abaddon. "And yet you're releasing one of them," replied Raspith. "Don't imagine that this fact has escaped me. What gives you the right to do this thing?" "Compassion, mostly," said Abaddon, unwilling to speak of any ulterior motives he might have had. "But he's guilty," objected Raspith. "Of this you know." "And are we innocent?" asked Abaddon. "What gives us the right to do this? Who are we to judge them? Is there no compassion or forgiveness remaining in your black heart, Raspith?" "None," replied Raspith. "I assure you that you'll come to regret this act of defiance against the master." "Perhaps," said Abaddon, "but not today. No, today I have the duty of sentencing you for your crimes against the Father and humanity." "And what gives you the right?" hissed Raspeth. "You and your kind were condemned to this place as surely as we are. You're not different from us." "I am nothing like you," objected Abaddon, his anger growing. "I have never been a party to the likes of this." "Have a care, sir," urged Abaddon's compatriot. "We can linger here no longer." There was a few seconds of hesitation. Abaddon wanted to give Raspeth a moment to consider his predicament, even as he savored this moment. But Lennar was right. They didn't have time. "Raspeth, I sentence you to the great sea of fire. You shall suffer like Serena suffered. I shall show you the type of justice that you have so long shown others." "Serena!" gasped Raspeth. "Yes," confirmed Abaddon. "Let the name sink into that pathetic mind of yours, while it still can, before the agony of the sea of fire obliterates all other thoughts but escape." In that moment, Abaddon swung Raspeth around, face down. He said not a word, yet his tiny minions understood only too well. They renewed their attack, yet their attack was most selective. They focused their assault on the point where Raspeth's wings met his back. Raspeth struggled, cursed, and screamed, but to no avail. It took scarcely half a minute to complete the task. Amidst a momentary eruption of dark red blood, the wings were sheared from his body at their roots. Raspeth let out a high-pitched squeal as his wings were cast aside, as the last tendons were stretched and severed. For a moment, the wings flapped around as though they had acquired a life of their own. Then they fell motionless. "It will take many hours for your wings to grow back," said Abaddon, pulling Raspeth to his feet. "That is out here in the open. But in the sea of fire, they will never grow back. You will be like the humans, indistinguishable from them. Your own kind will not even recognize you. Prepare yourself for the execution of your sentence." "No, you can't!" screamed Raspeth, as his feet left the ground behind. "I've served the Master faithfully for all of my existence. You can't do this to me." "I assure you I can," said Abaddon, with no trace of emotion. "But let not your heart be troubled. You shall continue to serve your master, only in a different capacity." The dark angels soared skyward, carrying the desecrated demon between them, screaming all the way. They passed into a sphere of shimmering stars and vanished. The remaining small creatures followed them into the sphere, and a quiet, the likes of which this place had not seen in 1,000 years, settled in. Yes, the remaining birds would eventually return, to feed upon the only source of sustenance they had ever known. What other choice did they have? But for a brief moment in eternity, the plains would know some measure of peace.